Carl Jung has always been an enigma, both controversial and confusing. His blending of psychology and religion, as well as his openness to different religious and spiritual philosophies, was not easy to accept for many psychiatrists and psychologists trying to pursue a purely scientific explanation of personality and mental illness. As an early colleague of Freud, Carl Jung broke from orthodox psychoanalysis to establish a separate theory of personality called Analytic Psychology, which rests on the assumption that occult phenomena can and do influence the lives of everyone. Jung believed that each of us is motivated not only by repressed experiences, but also by certain emotionally toned experiences inherited from our ancestors. These inherited images make up what Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious includes those elements that we have never experienced individually, but which have come down to us from our ancestors. Some elements of the collective unconscious become highly developed and are called archetypes. The most inclusive archetype is the notion of self-realization, which can be achieved only by attaining a balance between various opposing forces of personality. Thus, Jung's theory is a compendium of opposites. People are both introverted and extroverted, rational and irrational, both male and female, conscious and unconscious, and pushed by past events while being pulled by future expectations. In this video, we will look at some details in the long and colorful life of Carl Jung in order to use fragments from his life story to illustrate his concepts and theories. Jung's notion of a collective unconscious make his theory one of the most intriguing of all conceptions of personality. At the beginning of his autobiography entitled Memories, Dreams, Reflection, Jung described his life as a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Jung believed that our personality begins with the collective unconscious, developed within our species throughout our life or throughout time, and that we have only limited ability to control the psychic process that is our own personality. Thus, our true personality arises from within our collective unconscious, comes forth into our personal unconscious, and then our consciousness. Now, Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in the small town of Keswil, Switzerland, into an interesting and notable family. His grandfather, of the same name, had been a physician and had established the psychiatric clinic at the University of Basel and the Home of Good Hope for mentally retarded children. Now, a local rumor suggested that the elder Carl Jung was the illegitimate son of the great German poet Goethe. Although the elder Jung never acknowledged the rumor, the younger Jung at least sometimes believed himself to be the great grandson of Goethe. Both Jung's parents were the youngest of 13 children, a situation that that may have contributed to some of the difficulties they had in their marriage. Jung's father, Johann Paul Jung, was a minister in the Swiss Reformed Church, and his mother, Emily Praisework Jung, was the daughter of a theologian. In fact, 8 of Jung's maternal uncles and 2 of his paternal uncles were pastors. So both religion and medicine were prevalent in his family, and you can trace the combination of spirituality and science in Jung's theory here. Now, Jung's mother's family had a tradition of spiritualism and mysticism, and his maternal grandfather, Samuel Bracework, was a believer in the occult and often believes or talks to the dead. He actually kept an empty chair for the ghost of his first wife and had regular intimate conversations with her. You can only imagine how this practice infuriated the man's second wife. Now, Jung's parents had three children: a son born before Carl, but who lived only 3 days, and a daughter 9 years younger than Carl. Thus, Jung's early life was that of an only child. Now, during Jung's early childhood, he did not always have the best relationships with his parents. He considered his mother to be a good mother, but he felt that her true personality has always been hidden. She spent some time in the hospital when Carl was 3 years old, in part due to problem in her marriage. Jung found this separation from his mother deeply troubling, and he began to mistrust the spoken word love. Since his father was a pastor, there were often funerals and burials, all of which was very mysterious to the young Jung. In addition, his mother was considered a spiritual medium, and often helped Jung with his later studies on the occult. Perhaps most troubling of all was Jung's belief that his father did not really know God, but rather had become a minister trapped in the performance of meaningless ritual. Now, as an only child until he was 9, Jung preferred to be left alone, or at least he came to accept his loneliness. Even when his parents' guests brought their children over to visit, Jung would simply play his games alone. In his biography, he wrote that he recalled only that, or rather, I recall only that I did not want to be disturbed. I was deeply absorbed in my games and could not endure being watched or judged while playing them. So he also had extraordinarily rich and meaningful dreams, many of which were quite frightening, and they often involved deeply religious themes. This is hardly surprising since two uncles on his father's side rather, were ministers, and there were six more ministers on his mother's side. Thus, he was often engaged in religious discussions at home. He was particularly impressed with a richly illustrated book on Hinduism, with pictures of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which are considered the Hindu trinity of gods. So even at 6 years old, he felt a vague connection with the Hindu gods, something that once again would have an interesting influence on his later theories. Now, these dreams led Jung into deep religious speculations. Sometimes he considered to be a secret that he could not share with anyone else. Now, during his school years, things got a little bit weirder. Now, Jung gradually became aware of two separate aspects of himself. And he called this his number one and number two personalities. At first, he saw both personalities as part of his own personal world. But during adolescence, he became aware of the number two personality as a reflection of something other than himself, an old man, since long dead. At this time, Jung did not fully comprehend these separate powers. But in later years, he recognized that number two personality had been in touch with feelings and intuitions that number one personality did not perceive. We will talk more about intuitions and feelings later on. Now, between his 16th and 19th years, Jung's number one personality emerged as more dominant, as his conscious, everyday personality prevailed. He could concentrate on school and career. In Jung's own theory of attitudes, his number one personality was extroverted and in tune to the objective world, whereas his number two personality was introverted and directed towards his subjective world. Thus, during his early school years, Jung was mostly introverted, but when the time came to prepare for a profession and meet other objective responsibilities, he became more extroverted, an attitude that prevailed until he experienced a midlife crisis and entered a period of extreme introversion. When Jung decided to enter medical school, he did not leave his interest in strange spiritual matters behind. His cousin, Helen Priestworth, led seances in which she would fall into a trance and channel strange spirits. Now, the climax of these trances was often a mandala. Now, if you're not very familiar, a mandala is a geometric figure that represents wholeness, completeness, and perfection. So, she would dictate this to Hume and then attempt to translate what was told by her by the spirits. Now, Eugene Blower urged Jung to publish his studies on occult phenomena. Remember, you might actually be familiar with Eugene Blower as he actually defined schizophrenia. So, Jung did all this, and later on he published his works on the occult under the title On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. Another important event that occurred early during Jung's medical training was the death of his father. Now, the church had no provisions for the family of a deceased minister. But one of his uncles loaned Jung the money he needed to continue his studies. Upon completing medical school, he joined Blower in Zurich and soon became the first assistant physician. Now, their work were actually, or rather, their work were actually renowned, and Blower was considered one of the two most influential psychiatrists of his day. So, and the clinic where they were working in come to prominence under his predecessor, Auguste Forel, who was the first person to formally publish the theory that neurons communicate through synaptic junction. Though just how was that possible was not well understood at that time. Now, Hume worked Hume worked very hard, as Blower expected nothing less. He also spent some time in France where he met Pierre Janet. Janet is a curious figure in the history of psychoanalysis, but we won't be studying his theories here. He actually claimed that he developed everything good in psychoanalysis and that everything Freud developed was actually bad. Janet also apparently suggested that only the corrupt city of Vienna, remember, Freud came from Vienna, could be the source of a theory that traces the development of personality to sexual urges. Now, Jung spoke favorably of what he learned from Janet. Freud soundly rejected Janet's claims, but did grudgingly acknowledge that Janet did some important work on understanding neurosis. Now, in 1906, Jung sent Freud a copy of his book, the psychology of dementia precox, which was the early term for schizophrenia, which Freud actually found quite impressive. Now, the two met in February 1907 and actually talked for nearly 13 straight hours. According to Jung, Freud was the first man of real importance I had encountered. No one else could compare with him. Now, very quickly, as evidenced in the letters quoted at the beginning uh, of his life, or at the beginning of Jung's career, Freud felt that Jung would become the leader of the psychoanalytic movement. In 1909, Jung's psychoanalytic practices was so busy that he resigned from the clinic where he was working in, and he traveled to America with Freud. During this trip, the two men spent a great deal of time together. It quickly became evident to Jung that he could not be the successor that Freud was seeking. Jung had too many differences of opinion with Freud. More importantly, however, Jung described Freud as a neurotic and wrote that the symptoms were sometimes highly troublesome, though Jung failed to identify those symptoms. Freud thought that everyone was a little neurotic, but Jung wanted to know how to cure neurosis. Clearly, Jung could not accept a dogmatic approach to psychoanalysis, since he believed that God himself had told him not to follow any rigid system of rules. Even worse, this was when Jung first published his discovery of the collective unconscious. Freud wholly rejected this concept, and Jung felt that his creativity was being rejected too. He offered to support Freud in public while extending honest opinions in so-called secret letters. Freud wanted none of this. Almost as quickly as their relationship had grown, it actually fell apart. Now, the loss of his relationship with Freud, following the loss of his father, led Jung into a period of personal crisis. He resigned his position at the University of Zurich and began a lengthy series of experiments in order to understand the fantasies and dreams that aroused from his unconscious. The more he studied these phenomena, the more he realized they were not from his own memories, but from the collective unconscious. He was particularly curious about mandala drawings, which date back thousands of years in all cultures. He studied Christian Gnosticism, alchemy, and the I Ching, or Book of Changes. After meeting Richard Wilhelm, which is an expert in Chinese culture, Jung studied more Taoist philosophy, and he wrote a glowing foreword for Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching. These extraordinarily diverse interests led Jung to seek more in-depth knowledge from around the world. He actually traveled first to North Africa, then to America to visit Pueblo Indians in New Mexico. Next came East Africa, which included Uganda and Kenya. And finally, he went to India. Now, Jung made every effort to get away from civilized areas, which might have been influenced by other cultures, in order to get a more realistic impression of the local culture. And he was particularly successful in this regard in meeting gurus in India. Now, through it all, he continued his work in psychology. He had developed his concept of psychological types, one of the most significant contributions, and published his work shortly after the break with Freud. He continued to develop his own form of psychoanalysis. Now, Jung's family was also an important part of his life. He had married Emma Rosenbach in 1903, and they had 4 daughters and 1 son. Now, followed by 19 grandchildren and many great-grandchildren. Now, Emma Hume was very supportive of her husband, especially during the more turbulent periods of his career, including the break with Freud. And she was no stranger to his work. She had done some analytic work with Freud herself. She wrote essays on Jung's concept of anima and animus, and she was the first president of the Psychological Club of Zurich. When his wife Emma died in 1955, Jung wrote in a letter that the loss had taken a lot out of him, and that at his age, at that time around 80 years old, it wasn't easy to recover. Carl Jung died at home in 1961 at the age of 85. Now, as psychologists today examine more deeply the relationship between Eastern and Western perspectives, it may be the legacy of Jung that has yet been fulfilled. Now, Carl Jung holds an extraordinary place in the histories of both psychology and psychiatry. Having already been an assistant to the renowned psychiatrist Eugene Bleuer, he went to Vienna to learn more about the fledgling science of psychoanalysis. He became Freud's hand-picked heir to the psychoanalytic throne, and was one of the psychiatrists who accompanied Freud to America. Later, however, as he developed his own theories, he parted ways with Freud. Freud eventually came to describe Jung's theories as incomprehensible, and Freud praised other psychiatrists who also opposed Jung's ideas. Now, the most dramatic contribution that Jung made to psychodynamic thought was his concept of the collective unconscious, a mysterious reservoir of the psychological constructs common to all people. Jung traveled extensively, as we have talked about earlier, including trips to Africa, India, and the United States, particularly to visit Indians, as what we have said earlier, in Mexico, or in New Mexico. And he studied the cultures in those places. He also observed many basic similarities between different cultures. Those similarities led Hume to propose the collective unconscious. How else could so many significant cultural similarities have arisen within separate and distant lands? Now, Hume did not reject the concepts already developed by Freud and Adler, which we will be talking about in the future, including the dynamic interaction between the conscious mind and the personal unconscious. But he extended them in order to connect them with his own theory of an underlying collective unconscious. As strange as this theory seemed to Freud, and Freud wondered whether it even made sense to Hume, such a concept is not difficult to understand from an Eastern perspective. So initially, Hume's theories had more influence on art, literature, and anthropology than they did on psychiatry or psychology. More recently, however, cognitive behavioral theorists have begun to explore mindfulness as an addition to more traditional aspects of CBT. As psychologists today study concepts from yoga and Buddhism that are thousands of years old, Jung deserved the credit for bringing such an open-minded approach to the modern world of psychotherapy. Many famous and influential people admire Jung's work, including psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, psychologist Erich Fromm, and authors Hermann Hesse and H.G. Wells, and Nobel laureate Wolfgang Pauli. Now, in addition, Jung's discussion of how the libido has transformed throughout the evolution of the human species sound very much like sociobiology, which was not an established field until 1970s. Clearly, Jung did not simply dabble in a wide range of ideas, but rather he had an extraordinary vision of the complexity of the human psyche. Now, in order to distinguish his own approach to psychology from others that had come before him, Jung felt that he needed a unique name. Freud, of course, had chosen the term psychoanalysis, whereas Alfred Adler had chosen individual psychology. Since Jung admired both men and their theories, he chose a name intended to encompass not only their approaches, but others as well. Thus, he chose to call his approach analytical psychology. Now, analytical psychology emphasizes the importance of wholeness for each individual. As in traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, analytical psychology suggests that early experiences are very important in personality development. At the same time, though, analytical psychology emphasizes the significance of the present, including the role that cultural shifts and archetypes or underlying universal symbol play in individual psychology. Now, by bringing together an understanding of the individual experiences within, with a recognition of the role played by broader truth and experiences, analytical psychology hopes to work towards an integrated human consciousness. Now, analytical psychology, as presented by Jung, addressed the question of the psyche in an open-minded way. He laments the overly scientific approach of the late 1800s and efforts to explain away the psyche as a mere epiphenomenon of brain function. Curiously, the debate remains with us today and is still unanswered in any definitive way. Jung did not accept the suggestion that the psyche must come from the activity of the brain. This allowed him to consider the possibility of a collective unconscious and fit well with his acceptance of the wisdom of Eastern philosophers. Now, indeed, Jung suggests that psychology will find truth only when it accepts both Eastern and Western, as well as both scientific and spiritual perspectives on the psyche. Now, Jung, like Freud, based his personality theory on the assumption that the mind or psyche has both conscious and an unconscious level. Unlike Freud, however, Jung strongly asserted that the most important portion of the unconscious springs not from personal experiences of the individual, but from the distant past human existence, a concept Jung called the collective unconscious. Of lesser importance to Jungian theory are the conscious and the personal unconscious. Now, according to Jung, conscious images are those that are sensed by the ego, whereas unconscious elements have no relationship with the ego. Jung's notion of the ego is more restrictive than Freud's. Jung saw the ego as the center of consciousness, as seen in this image here, but not the core of the personality. Ego is not the whole personality, as suggested by this image right here, that the image is or that the ego is just one part of the personality. But it must be completed by the more comprehensive self, which is the center of personality that is largely unconscious. Now, in a psychologically healthy person, the ego takes a secondary position to the unconscious self. Thus, consciousness plays a relatively minor role in analytical psychology, and an overemphasis on expanding one's conscious psyche can lead to psychological imbalance. Healthy individuals, for Hume, are in contact with their conscious world, but they also allow themselves to experience their unconscious selves and thus to achieve individuation, a concept which we will expound later on. Now, perhaps Jung's most unique contribution to psychology is his distinction between personal unconscious and collective unconscious. Now, uh, the personal unconscious is not entirely different than the one proposed by Freud, but it's more extensive. In addition to repressed memories and impulses, the personal unconscious contains undeveloped aspects of the personality and materials arising from the collective unconscious that is not yet ready for admission into the into conscious awareness. Consider Freud's idea on the relationship between unconscious and the preconscious. Now, the personal unconscious is revealed through clusters of emotions, such as those resulting in a particular attitude towards one's father or other father figures, which Hume referred to as a complex. Now, in this sense, a complex is not synonymous with a psychological problem, as the term is often used today, but rather any general state of mind common to certain situations. In this context, it's quite similar. Or rather, Jung's concept of complexes is quite similar to the schemas discussed by cognitive and social psychologists. Now, Jung arrived at his theory of complexes as a result of his own research in schizophrenia under the direction of Dr. Bloor. Bloor had assigned Jung the task of studying the word association test, in which a list of 100 words is read to the patient, and the therapist watches for evidences of emotional arousal, such as pauses, failures to respond, or even physical acts. In addition, Hume noticed that even with schizophrenic patients, the patterns of word association were often centered on a particular theme. That theme could then be regarded as a complex, which again could be either positive or negative. Sometimes, complexes remain unsolved, such as one's feeling about parents, if the parents have died already. In relatively healthy individuals, these unresolved complexes could result in dreams, visions, or similar phenomena pertaining to the object or of the unresolved complex. Now, these complexes might even become personified. In the extreme situation of personified complexes, such as in a person suffering from schizophrenia, the patient cannot distinguish the personification of the unresolved complex from the seeming reality of being another person. Hence, the schizophrenic hears voices in their head, spoken by someone else that nobody actually hears. As Jung further investigated the nature and themes of complexes in psychiatric patients, he found common themes that could not always be attributed to the patient's personal history. And so, he began to form his concept of the collective unconscious. Now, whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. It represents Jung's most controversial and perhaps his most distinctive concept. Now, the physical contents of the collective unconscious are inherited and passed from one generation to the next as psychic potentials. Distant ancestors' experiences with, say, universal concepts such as God, Mother, Water, Earth, and so forth have been transmitted through the generations so that people in every clime and time have been influenced by their primitive ancestors' primordial experiences. Therefore, the contents of the collective unconscious are more or less the same for everyone. So, while, for example, there are two individuals who have their own uniqueness, by virtue of their conscious and personal unconscious, they are unique with each other, or from each other, but because they share a collective unconscious, they are deep down the same. So, the contents of the collective unconscious do not lie dormant, but are active and influence a person's thoughts, emotions, and actions. Now, the collective unconscious is responsible for people's many myths, legends, and religious beliefs. It also produces big dreams, that is, dreams with meaning beyond the individual dreamers and that are filled with significance for people of every time and place. Now, the collective unconscious does not refer to inherited ideas, but rather humans' innate tendencies to react in a particular manner whenever their experience stimulate a biological inheritance response tendency. For example, a young mother may unexpectedly react with love and tenderness to her newborn infant, even though she previously had negative or neutral feelings towards the fetus. The tendency to respond was part of the woman's innate potential or inherited blueprint. Now, let's further talk about the contents of the collective unconscious as proposed by Jung. And he called these contents the archetypes. Now, archetypes are ancient or archaic images that derive from the collective unconscious. They are similar to complexes in that they are emotionally toned collections of associated images, but whereas complexes are individualized components of the personal unconscious, archetypes are generalized and derived from the contents of the collective unconscious. Archetypes should also be distinguished from instincts. Jung defined an instinct as an unconscious physical impulse towards action, and saw archetype as the psychic counterpart to an instinct. So, instincts are physical, whereas archetypes are psychical. Complexes are derived from our personal unconscious, and archetypes are derived from our collective unconscious. Now, archetypes have universal meanings across cultures and may show up in dreams, literature, art, or even religion. Jung believed symbols from different cultures are often very similar because they have emerged from archetypes shared by whole human race, which are part of our collective unconscious. For Jung, our primitive pasts become the basis of the human psyche, directing and influencing present behavior. Jung claimed to identify a large number of archetypes but paid special attention to four. Now, according to Jung, the most empirically valid archetypes and therefore the main powerful ones are the shadow, the anima, and the shadow, the anima, and the animus, the self, and the persona, which we will be talking about later on. Speaking of which, the persona is how we present ourselves to the world. Now, the word persona is derived from a Latin word that literally means mask. We have learned about this in our first lesson in this course. It's not a literal mask, however. The persona reflects all of the different social masks that we wear among various groups and situations. It acts to shield the ego from negative images. According to Jung, the persona may appear in dreams and take different forms. Now, over the course of development, children learn that they must behave in certain ways in order to fit in with society's expectations and norms. Now, the persona develops as a social mask to contain all of the primitive urges, impulses, and emotions that are not considered socially acceptable. Now, the persona archetypes allows people to adapt to the world around them and fit in the society in which they live in. However, becoming too closely identified with this archetype can lead people to lose sight of their true selves. Now, the second archetype is the shadow. Now, the shadow is an archetype that consists of the sex and life instincts. So, the shadow exists as part of the unconscious mind and is composed of repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings. So, the shadow form out our attempt to adapt to cultural norms and expectations. So, it's the archetype that contains all of the things that are unacceptable, not only to society, but also to one's own personal morals and values. It might include things like envy, prejudice, hate, aggression, and even lust. Jung suggested that the shadow can appear in dreams or visions and may take a variety of form. It might appear as a snake, a monster, a demon, a dragon, or some other dark, wild, and exotic figures. Now, this archetype is often described as the darker side of the psyche, representing wildness, chaos, and the unknown. Now, these latent dispositions are present in all of us. Jung believed, although people sometimes deny this element of their own psyche and instead project it to other people. So, but we have to consider that the shadow is not entirely evil. Rather, Jung described it as an unadapted and awkward, much like a child trying to function in a company of adults. Now, trying to entirely suppress the shadow is not the appropriate solution, since the shadow is driving us forward in our efforts to achieve balance between the unconscious and conscious realities. In other words, just as a child may act inappropriately with trying to grow up, the shadow may cause inappropriate behavior in oppositions to the accepted rules of society. Nonetheless, it is important for us to have that driving force pushing us towards self-development and the development of human species. So that we don't simply live in a life of passivity and our reactions to outside world. It is the shadow that actually pushes forward. Now, the next is the anima or the animus. Now, the anima is the feminine image in the male psyche, and the animus is the male image in the feminine psyche. The anima, animus, and the animus represents the true self rather than the image we present to others and serve as the primary source of communication with the collective unconscious. Jung believed that physiological changes as well as social influences contribute to the development of sex roles and gender identities. Jung suggested that the influence of the animus and anima archetypes are also involved in this process. According to Jung, animus represent the masculine aspect in women, while the anima represent the feminine aspects in men. Now, this archetypal image are based upon both what is found in the collective and personal unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious may contain notions about how women should behave, while personal experiences with wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers, TikTokers, and even influencers contribute to more personal images of women. In many cultures, however, men and women are encouraged to adopt traditional and often rigid gender roles. Jung suggested that this discouragement of men exploring their feminine side and women exploring their masculine aspects serve to undermine psychological development. Now, the combined anima and animus is known as the syzygy, spelled as Syzygy, or the divine couple. Now, the syzygy represents completion, unification, and wholeness. Now, the next archetype is the self. Now, the self is an archetype that represents the unified unconscious and consciousness of an individual. Jung often represents the self as a circle, a square, or mandala. Creating the self occurs through the process known as individuation, in which the various aspects of personality are integrated. Jung believed that this harmony between the unconscious and the unconscious mind could lead to psychological problems. Bringing these conflicts into awareness and accommodating them in conscious awareness was an important part of the individuation process. Jung suggests that there were two different centers of personality. The ego makes up the center of consciousness, but it is the self that lies at the center of personality. Let me repeat that. The ego makes up the center of consciousness. So, in the world of the conscious, the ego is the king. But underneath that, or beyond that rather, is the self that lies at the center of personality. Personality, again, encompasses not only conscious, but also the ego and the unconscious mind. So, you can think of this by imagining a circle with a dot right at the center. Now, the entire circle makes up the self, whereas the small dot in the middle represents the ego. So, for Jung, the ultimate aim was for an individual to achieve a sense of cohesive self, similar in many ways to Maslow's concept of self-actualization. Now, there are other archetypes. Okay, so as defined by Jung, there are other existing archetypes which are not static or fixed. Instead, many different archetypes may overlap or combine at any given time. Now, here are just some of the few of the various archetypes that Jung described. Now, you have the archetype of the father, which is an authority figure, which is both stern and powerful. Then you have the mother, both nurturing and comforting. The child, who is longing for innocence, rebirth, and salvation. And you have the wise old man, like Gandalf, which provides guidance, knowledge, and of course, wisdom. Then you have the hero, the champion, the defender, the rescuer. And then you have the maiden, which is innocence, desire, purity. And lastly, you have the trickster. Not so much different to Loki, who is a deceiver, a liar, a troublemaker. Now, Hume recognizes various psychological types that grow out of a union between two basic attitudes, that is extroversion and extraversion, and four separate functions. You have thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. Now, Hume defined an attitude as a predisposition to act or react in a characteristic direction. He insisted that each person has both an introverted and an extroverted attitude. Although one may be conscious while the other is unconscious. Like other opposing forces in analytic psychology, introversion and extraversion serve in a compensatory relationship to one another and can be illustrated by the yin and yang motif. Now, the two attitude types are based on one's orientation to external object, which actually can include other people. Now, the introvert is intent on withdrawing libido from other people, as if to ensure that the object or other people can have no power over the person. In contrast, the extrovert extends libido towards an object, establishing an active relationship. Jung considered extroverts and extroverts to be common among all groups of people, from all walks of life. Today, most psychologists acknowledge that there are clear genetic components to these temperaments. a suggestion proposed by Jung as well. Of course, one cannot have an orientation to object without consciousness. And consciousness cannot exist without an ego. For Hume, the ego is a complex, so it is associated with both conscious psyche and the personal unconscious. According to Hume, it's always in the center of our attention and of our desires, and it's absolutely indispensable center of consciousness. Now, both introversion and extraversion can combine with any one or more of four functions, forming 8 possible orientations or types. Now, the 4 functions are sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuiting. Can be briefly defined as seen here. Now, sensing tells people that something exists. Thinking enables them to recognize its meaning. Feelings tell them its value or worth rather. And intuition allows them to know about it without knowing how they know. So, Hume's 4 functions describe ways in which we orient ourselves to the external environment, given our basic tendencies towards introversion or extraversion. Now, the first opposing pair of functions is thinking versus feeling. Thinking involves intellect. It tells you what a thing is, whereas feeling is value-based. It tells you what a thing is worth for you. For example, if you're trying to choose what to do on a weekday afternoon, perhaps you need to choose between attending a required online class as opposed to a personally interesting Netflix series. If you are guided first by thinking, you will probably choose to attend the class. But if you are guided by feeling, you may choose to watch the Netflix series which satisfies your more immediate interests. Now, the second opposing pair of functions is sensing versus intuition. Sensing describes paying attention to the reality of your external environment. It tells you that something is. Okay? In contrast, intuition incorporates a sense of time and allows for hunches. Intuition may even seem mysterious, and Hume freely acknowledged that he is particularly mystical, yet he offers an interesting perspective on this issue. He said that intuition is a function by which you see round corners, which you really cannot do, yet the fellow will do it for you and you trust him. It's a function which normally you do not use if you live a regular life within 4 walls and do regular routine work. But if you are on, say, stock exchange or in Central Africa, you will use your hunches like anything. You cannot, for instance, calculate whether when you turn around the corner in a bush you will see or you will meet a rhinoceros or a tiger, but you get a hunch and it will perhaps save your life. Now, the 2 attitudes and the 4 functions combine to form 8 personality types. Jung described a so-called cross of the functions, which the ego in the center being influenced by the pairs of functions. Now, considering whether the ego's attitude is primarily introverted or extroverted, one could also propose a parallel pair of crosses. Jung's theory on personality types has proven quite influential and led to the development of 2 well-known and very popular instruments used to measure one's personality type: So that one might then make reasoned decisions about real life choices. Now, you have 8 personality types, the first of which is introverted thinking, uh, which is focused on one's own internal thoughts and ideas, do not communicate well. They can be highly conflicted and will lash out at critics. They are generally stubborn and do not get along well with others. They can be philosophers, theoretical scientists, and even some inventors. Then you have introverted feeling, which tends to be silent, inaccessible, and melancholy. They have deep emotions but hide them and appear cold and reserved on the surface. They tend to be suspicious of others, and they are most of them are actually women, according to Carl Jung. Now they can be subjective movie critics and art appraisers. Now the third type is introverted sensing. These people are guided, or people with this personality type are guided by subjective impressions of real life objects, often expresses their sensation through artistic endeavors. Now, the objective world may seem make-believe and comical. Some of the examples, people who have this personality type gravitate towards being artists or even classical musicians. Now, the fourth personality type is introverted intuitive type, which tend to be peculiar and lack contact with reality. They may be completely misunderstood even by those who are close to them and may seem like mystical dreamers and seers on one hand, but just a cranky person on the other. They may have vision but lack convincing power of reason. Some of them can be prophets, mystics, religious fanatics, and the likes. The fifth is extroverted thinking. People with this personality type seek intellectual conclusions based on objective reality. They seek to influence others, suppress emotions, can be rigid and dogmatic, that is tyrannical sometimes when others penetrate their power province. They can be researchers, scientists, accountants, and even mathematicians. Then you have extroverted feeling type. Feel, whose feelings harmonize with objective situations. They can be highly emotional, and they will avoid thinking when it proves upsetting for them. Most are actually women, according to Carl Jung. They can be good real estate appraisers and even objective movie critics. Then you have extroverted sensing. Now, they are immersed in realism and they seek new experiences. Now, whole aim is concrete enjoyment, and most are men. So they can be wine tasters, proofreaders, popular musicians, house painters, and probably the likes. Lastly, you have extroverted intuitive type who always seek new opportunities. They may seize new opportunities with enthusiasm and just as quickly abandon it if not promising. Has vision and often found among business tycoons and politicians, but have little regard for the welfare of others. They can be inventors and even religious reformers. Now, the four functions usually appear in hierarchy, with one occupying a superior position, another a secondary position, and the other two inferior positions. So most people cultivate only one function. So they characteristically approach a situation relying on the one dominant or superior function. So some people develop two functions, and a few very mature individuals have cultivated three. A person who has theoretically achieved self-realization, or in Jung's terms, individuation, would have all four functions highly developed. Lastly, let's talk about Jung's concept of reality or humanity. Now, Jung's ideas have not been very or as popular as Freud's. This might be because he did not write for the layman, and as such, his ideas were not greatly disseminated as Freud's. It may also be because his ideas were a little more mystical and obscure and are less clearly explained than that of Freud. Jung is like the little bear in Goldilocks' story. Always not too much and not too little when it comes to his concept of reality. Jung saw humans as complex beings with many opposing poles. His view of humanity was neither pessimistic nor optimistic, neither deterministic nor purposive. To him, people are motivated partly by conscious thought, partly by images from their personal unconscious, and partly by latent memory traced from or inherited from their ancestral past. Their motivation comes from both causal and teleological factors. The complex makeup of humans invalidates any simple or one-sided description for Carl Jung. According to Jung, each person is a composite of opposing forces. No one is completely introverted or totally extroverted. Please pay attention to this. Please remember that when it comes to Jung, no one is 100% introvert nor 100% extrovert. We are, for Jung, always a combination of both. All male or female, solely a thinking, feeling, sensing, or intuitive person, and no one proceeds invariably in the direction of either progression or regression. Now, the persona is but a fraction of an individual. What one wishes to show others is usually only the socially acceptable side of personality. Every person for Carl Jung has a dark side, a shadow, and most of us actually try to conceal it from both society and from ourselves. In addition, each man or woman possesses an anima, and every woman, possesses an animus. So the various complexes and archetypes cast their spell over people and are responsible for many of their words and actions and most of their dreams and fantasies. Although people are not masters in their own houses, neither are they completely dominated by force beyond their control. For Hume, people have some limited capacity to determine their lives, though through strong will and with great courage, they can explore the hidden recesses of their psyche. They can recognize their shadow as their own, become partially conscious of their feminine or masculine side, and cultivate more than a single function. This process, which Jung called individuation or self-realization, is not easy and demand more fortitude than most people can muster. Ordinarily, a person who has achieved self-realization has reached middle life and has lived successfully through the stages of childhood and youth. Now, during middle age, they must be willing to set aside the goals and behaviors of youth and adopt a new style appropriate to their stage of psychic development. Even after people have achieved individuation, made an acquaintance with their inner world, and brought the various opposing forces into balance, they remain under the influence of an impersonal unconscious or collective unconscious that controls many of their prejudices, interests, fears, dreams, and creative activities. On the dimension of biology versus social aspects of personality, Jung's theory leans strongly in the direction of of biology. The collective unconscious, which is responsible for many actions, is part of our biology, or our biological inheritance, according to Jung. Except for the therapeutic potential of the doctor-patient relationship, Jung had little to say about differential effects of specific social practices. In fact, his studies of various cultures, he found the difference to be superficial, the similarities profound. Thus, analytical psychology can also be rated highly on similarities among people and low on individual differences. So this ends our discussion on Carl Jung's analytical psychology. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.